On Jacques Monod. This appendix is devoted to an analysis of excerpts from Monod's inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, published by Le Monde on November 30, 1967. To the first, this critique was initially the object of the fourth lecture. I reproduce it as delivered, without any alteration. Monod's text is an exceptional document, of an unparalleled scientific quality and intellectual honesty. I speak of it with the greatest respect, and I hope to give proof of that throughout my analysis. It will be seen that I do not accord myself any right to intervene in its strictly scientific content, which I accept unreservedly as an absolute reference for any philosophical reflection. At the same time, it will be seen that I not only accord myself the right, but also the duty, even vis-à-vis Monod, to make a clear distinction between its strictly scientific content and the philosophical use of which it is the object, not on the part of philosophers external to Monod but on the part of Monod himself, in element 2 of his SPS, in his philosophy and his worldview, WV. I will discuss Monod's SPS, his philosophy and his WV in the most objective manner possible. In speaking of Monod and citing his declarations, I am not attacking Monod himself but the realities which appear in his own consciousness as so many realities which appear in the consciousness of all scientists, and therefore as so many objective realities independent of the subjective personality of the scientists. Through the analysis of Monod's text, I want to bring out objective general realities, the form of which varies according to the individuals, their disciplines, and the historical moment of their science, which dominate and govern the consciousness of all scientists, usually without their knowing it. I speak of scientists in the strict sense. However, you will already have realized that what I say about them is infinitely more true of specialists in the human sciences and also, although with specific differences, of mere philosophers. One last word concerning the particular form which those general elements take in Monod. As we shall see, they culminate in an idealist worldview that I do not share. But Monod's worldview represents an idealistic tendency whose form is quite particular. In terms of its scientific content, it may be considered the richest form of idealism to be found in this idealist tendency. I also see another very important sign, an indication of this in the fact that the morality which dominates Monod's worldview is what he calls an ethics of knowledge, that is, an ethics closely linked to scientific practice. Because of its scientific richness, its honesty and its nobility, Monod's text is in our opinion an exceptional text, to which I would like to pay public homage. This is only a philosopher's homage. I would be happy if it were taken for what it is, the homage of a philosopher, but a homage nevertheless. For the clarity of the exposition, I will distinguish four elements in Monod's lecture. 1. Modern biological science. 2. The spontaneous philosophy of the scientist, SPS. 3. Philosophy. 4. Worldview, WV. 1. Modern biological science. It is present in the explanation Monod gives of his most recent findings and fundamental principles. This exposition may be articulated in 3 moments, as follows. A. The statement of the content of the discovery which has transformed modern biology, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, the constituent of chromosomes, the guardian of heredity, and the source of evolution, the philosopher's stone of biology. B. The reflection of this revolutionary scientific discovery in the concepts of biological theory, the concepts of emergence and of teleonomy. New key concepts of modern biological theory. C. Retrospectively, these new concepts show that the old concepts of classical theory, evolution, finality, have been preserved but transcended in a new form. In a parallel way, the old philosophical theories linked to biological concepts, vitalism, mechanism, and the philosophies exploiting the results or the difficulties of biology, religious philosophy, metaphysics, appear to have been transcended but not preserved, rejected without appeal. 2. The spontaneous philosophy of the scientist, biologist, SPS, it is present throughout the exposition of the findings of modern biology, of its reflection in biological theory, and of its retrospective effects. We may distinguish the presence of two elements. Element 1, intra-scientific, materialist. Element 2, extra-scientific, idealist. Element 1, of the SPS, basically materialist, basically dialectical. As a general rule, element 1 is almost always, if not invariably, intricated in the exposition of scientific findings and therefore mixed in the scientific material itself. It is not isolated, and the scientist does not make it the object of his thought. It is up to us to disintricate it, thus to make it appear in its distinction by drawing a philosophical line of demarcation. Element 1 appears, then, on the occasion of the exposition, and of the reasons adduced for it, as a tendency confronted by, and opposed to, other tendencies. This fact is very striking in Monod's text, which is exemplary in this respect. Monod does not declare himself to be a materialist or a dialectical thinker. These words do not appear in his text. But everything he says about modern biology displays a profound materialist and dialectical tendency, visible in positive assertions coupled with determinate philosophical condemnations. A. Materialism sensitive points. Definition of the material reality of the object of biology via a critique of the notion, scientifically outmoded and functioning only in certain philosophies, of living matter. This one-word denunciation is a denunciation of philosophical exploitation, and therefore of an anti-scientific tendency. Very precisely, it is the denunciation of the vitalist philosophy which is implied in the notion of living matter. The expression living matter is meaningless. There are living systems. There is no living matter. It is a denunciation of the use of the ambiguous notion of living matter by certain physicists themselves, and of the exploitation of this notion by metaphysics and religious philosophy, an attack on tailored. The rejection of the notion of living matter does not in any sense take Monod back to spiritualism or idealism. He remains a materialist. Living systems have emerged in the material world, local emergence of complex structures endowed with specific qualities. This emergence is thought in terms of an openly materialist tendency. This emergence possesses a physical support, DNA. It will be noted that Monod's materialist theses are presented in a manner which is both positive and polemical. He rejects the philosophical elements, exploitative, to clear the way for the exposition of scientific findings. This operation is, in itself and because of its results, of a materialist tendency. b. Dialectic sensitive points, the critique of the ideological relation, philosophical exploitation, previously prevailing between emergence and teleonomy, formerly known as teleology, finalism. Monad rejects all theories that subordinate emergence, the sudden appearance of life, to teleonomy. Thus he rejects in the clearest manner the spiritual religious tendency which takes the view that if life appeared in the material world, it did so in order to realize a providential or natural end, to produce spirit. Here again he is attacking tailored and all religious spiritualist idealist exploitation of biology. As before, this critique opens the way to positive categories, especially to the category of emergence. In fact, the category of emergence functions in monad not only as a purely scientific category but also as a category representing a possible theory of a dialectic which is at work in nature itself. A very important category. In effect, monad proposes in the concept of emergence a rational kernel squared of a purely intra-scientific origin, which is, because of its theoretical potential and the tendency of this potential, full of dialectical resonance. In practical terms, and provided that we take it seriously, it allows us to think through what a certain philosophical tendency is looking for in connection with what has been called the laws of the dialectic, and even the dialectics of nature. Traditionally, one speaks of the qualitative leap, of the dialectical transition from quantity to quality, etc. In the notion of emergence, monad offers something that allows us, to a partial extent, to restate this question with intra-scientific elements. I recapitulate: materialism, dialectics. Such are the components of element 1 in monad. In the case of the modern biologist, that monad is, element 1 is in direct resonance with a definite philosophical tendency, dialectical materialism. Element 2, of the SPS, I said that this element is extra-scientific and idealist. Here again, monad is exemplary. Because element 2 appears in his work, almost in a pure state, this is not always the case with scientists, as a reprise of element 1 itself under a modality and the tendency completely opposed to the modality and the tendency wherein we were able to locate element 1. And in element 2 we are dealing with practically the same content as in element 1, but there has been an inversion of meaning, an inversion of tendency. Let us take up the two components of element 1, materialism and dialectics, to see what becomes of them in element 2. A. Materialism. In element 1, monad defined the materialist content of his tendency by eliminating mechanism and vitalism, by saying that there is no living matter but only living systems, and by designating DNA the physical support of those living systems. But when monad leaves the domain of biology, which he calls, using an already suspicious term, the biosphere, a Teilhardian term, to speak of what, using an even more suspicious term, he calls the noosphere, a Teilhardian term, he no longer respects the rules which govern the materialist content of element 1. At this point, we see that as the concepts of element 1 are put to use, the materialist tendency that ruled element 1 is inverted and becomes an idealist and even spiritualist tendency. The most striking symptom of this inversion is the inversion of monad's attitude to tailored. In element 1, monad is 100% against tailored. In element 2, monad resorts to two of tailored's concepts, the noosphere and the biosphere. As we shall see, The result is that the dialectic component expressed by the concept of emergence becomes idealist itself and lapses back into the very thing monad avoided in element 1, namely, the spiritualism mechanism couple. To be precise, monad proposes a theory of the birth of humanity. Only the latest of these accidents could lead to the emergence in the heart of the biosphere of a new realm, the noosphere, the realm of ideas and knowledge, which was born on the day when the new associations, the creative combinations in an individual could be transmitted to others, rather than dying with him. This thesis is then further specified: language created man. The realm of man is the noosphere. The noosphere is the kingdom of ideas and knowledge. In making this extrapolation, monad believes himself a materialist because for him language is not a spiritual origin, but simply an accidental emergence which has the informational resources of the human central nervous system as its biophysiological support. Yet in his theory of the noosphere, monad is in fact, though not according to his stated convictions, idealist, to be precise, mechanistic spiritualistic. Mechanistic because he believes he can give an account of the existence and content of the noosphere in terms of the effects triggered by the emergence of the biophysiological support of language, the human central nervous system. In simple terms, he thinks he can account for the content of the social existence of men, including the history of their ideas, as a mere effect of the play of neurobiological mechanisms. To extend, without any scientific justification, biological laws to the social existence of mankind is mechanism. Monad insists on the legitimacy of this arbitrary extension, although it is immaterial, and populated only by abstract structures. The noosphere presents close analogies to the biosphere from which it emerged. And he does not beat about the bush, he calls for the coming of the great mind, who will be able to write a sequel to the work of Darwin, A Natural History of the Selection of Ideas. Monad does not even wait for this great mind to be born. Without even charging him for it, he gives him a basis for the work to come, an astounding biologistic theory of ideas as endowed with the specific qualities of living species, dedicated to the same function and exposed to the same laws. There are ideas that possess an invasive power, others that are doomed to die out because they are parasitic species, still others ineluctably condemned to death by their rigidity. We fall back with this great avant-garde biologist upon banalities which have existed for more than a century and which Malthus and social Darwinism charged with ideological energy throughout the 19th century. Theoretically speaking, monad's mechanism resides in the following tendency: the mechanical application of the concepts and the laws of what he calls the biosphere to what he calls the noosphere, the application of the content of a materialism appropriate to the biological species to another real object, human societies. This is an idealist use of the materialist content of a determinate science, here, modern biology, in its extension to the object of another science. This idealist use of the materialist content of a determinate science consists of arbitrarily imposing upon another science, which possesses a real object, different from that of the first, the materialist content of the first science. Monad declares that the physical support of the biosphere is DNA. In the present state of biological science, this materialist thesis is unassailable. But when he believes himself to be materialist, by giving as the biophysiological basis of what he calls the noosphere, that is to say, the social and historical existence of the human species, the emergence of the neurobiological support of language, He is not a materialist but, as we have already said, a mechanistic materialist, and in terms of a theory of human history, that now means that he is an idealist. For the mechanistic materialism that was materialism's historical representative in the 18th century is today no more than one of the representatives of the idealist tendency in history. Insofar as Monod is a mechanist, he is necessarily also a spiritualist. His theory that language created mankind might find a sympathetic audience among certain philosophers of anthropology, of literature and, indeed, of psychoanalysis. But we should be suspicious of sympathetic audiences. It is in their interest deliberately to misunderstand what is said to them in order to hear what they want to hear. They may be correct in what they want to hear, but they are wrong in hearing it in what is said to them. The theory that language created humanity is, in Monod's lecture, a spiritualist theory which ignores the specificity of the materiality of the object in question. To say that language created man is to say that it is not the materiality of social conditions of existence, but what Monod himself calls the immateriality of the noosphere, this realm of ideas and knowledge, which constitutes the real base, and thus the principle, of the scientific intelligibility of human history. No essential difference separates these theses, which Monod believes to be scientific but which are in reality merely ideological, from the most classical theses of conventional spiritualism. Indeed, when one has given as the sole material base of the noosphere the biophysiological support of the central nervous system, one has to fill the void of the noosphere with the help of the spirit, because there is no other recourse, and certainly no scientific recourse. It is in this manner that the materialism of element 1 is inverted into idealism in element 2 of Monod's SPS. The inversion of the tendency affects the same content, the same concepts. In Monod the idealistic tendency is constituted as an effect of the mechanism-spiritualism couple. The logical genealogy of this inversion can be retraced: materialism at the start, then mechanism-spiritualism, and finally idealism. In Monod's case, mechanism is the precise point of sensibility, the point where the inversion takes place. A mechanistic use of biological materialism outside biology, in history, has the effect of inverting the materialist tendency into an idealist tendency. B. Dialectics. The same inversion. In element 1, the dialectic is materialist. It is present in the concept of emergence. This concept of emergence functions adequately from the scientific point of view in the domain of biological science. It functions in a materialist way. But when we leave the sphere of biology for the noosphere, the concept of emergence loses its original scientific content and is contaminated by the manner in which Monod thinks the nature of his new object, history. In history, the dialectic functions in an astonishing fashion. First, emergence proliferates, a true deus ex machina. Each time something new happens, a new idea, a new event, Monod utters the magic word emergence. As a general rule, it might be said that when a concept is used to think everything, it is in danger of not thinking anything at all. This is the failing Hegel once denounced in Schelling, who applied his theory of poles everywhere, formalism. Cube then, emergence functions in history not in the form appropriate to history but in the form proper to biology, witness the theory of the natural selection of ideas, an old imposture which Monod believes to be new. Finally, whether we like it or not, and despite what Monod has said about the primacy of emergence over teleonomy, and despite the excellence of his criticisms of Taylor and the finalists, it is the emergence of the noosphere, in other words, the emergence of the spirit, that forms the basis of history for Monod. Because the noosphere is, scientifically speaking, an empty concept. Because emergence and the noosphere are constantly associated, in a repeated manner, there results an objective philosophical effect in the mind, not, presumably, in Monod's mind but in that of his listeners and readers. This empty repetition in fact produces the effect of an inversion of sense and tendency, whether we like it or not. It is as though the noosphere were the most complex, finest and most extraordinary of the whole sequence of emergences. Thus it is a valorized product, if not de jure. Monod does not say so, then de facto. The sudden and miraculous multiplication of emergences in the noosphere is only a kind of empirical manifestation of this de facto privilege, which is a privilege nonetheless. The noosphere is the privileged sphere of the functioning of emergence. Thus the relationship is upset and it appears as if the sequence of emergences had, as its hidden end and teleonomy, the emergence of the noosphere. Monod might contest this interpretation. However, because he does not control the notions he manipulates in the domain of history, because he believes them to be scientific, whereas they are merely ideological, it is not surprising that he perceives only the intention of his discourse and not its objective effect. The dialectic, which is materialist in element 1, has become idealist in element 2, an inversion of tendency. I openly acknowledge that what I have just said has not really been proven, since I speak only of an effect of listening or reading, which in itself is imperceptible outside a convergence of diverse effects. I will analyze two more of these effects to reinforce what has been said. 1. Monod provides a definition of emergence which in fact contains two very different definitions. His lecture opens with this definition. I quote, "Emergence is the property of reproducing and multiplying highly complex ordered structures and of permitting the evolutionary creation of structures of increasing complexity." It would be fascinating to analyze closely this very thoughtful but lame formula because it contains two different definitions, two different characteristics, though in one and the same concept. Emergence is a double property, reproduction and creation. Everything is in the end. For the property of reproduction is one thing, the property of creation another. It is clear that the latter has scientific meaning in biology only on the basis of the former. If living forms did not have the property of reproduction and multiplication, nothing new could appear among them, and be both alive and more complex. Thus there is a link between reproduction and creation. But there is also a difference or a break, the unexpected appearance of the new, more complex than what preceded it. The small word and linking reproduction and creation in Monod may lead to two realities being confused. At any rate, it juxtaposes them. Now, a juxtaposition might be insufficient from a scientific point of view. Thus Monod does not adequately think through, beginning with the definition which is manifestly intended to designate one of the essential components of element 1 of the SPS, what he has said. Monod does not really distinguish the two properties in his definition. And yet, in the domain of the biological sciences, His scientific practice makes a perfectly clear distinction between properties which his definition simply juxtaposes. There are reproduction multiplication phenomena and the phenomenon of sudden appearances. When Monod causes the term emergence to intervene in his scientific expose, it is practically always to designate the sudden appearance of new forms. Reproduction always remains in the shadows. Indeed, it does not play any scientific role in thinking the sudden appearance of new forms. It only shows that we are dealing with life, with forms which reproduce and multiply. This question is resolved by DNA. Thus, in his practice Monod very clearly makes a distinction which he does not think in his definition, unless one considers that he thinks it under the form of the conjunction and, which is insufficient. Hegel wrote many interesting things on the usage scientists make in their language and practice of that little word and. Scientists should read these pages, which directly concern them, the phenomenology of mind. As we proceed with this analysis, I hope that this definition of emergence will produce in its central silence, the word and an effect similar to that of the creation, an unfortunate word, of new forms of increasing complexity, that it will allow the notion of emergence to cease being something that remains unthought and functions as an unthought finality, and therefore to change tendency, from materialism to idealism. 2. Analogous considerations might be developed in relation to the concept of chance in Monod. In fact, the concept of emergence is clearly bound up with the concept of chance. In biology, chance is in a sense a precise index of the conditions of possibility of emergence. So be it. Since Epicurus, it has played a positive materialist role in combating finalist exploitations of biology. But we then find that Monod retains the concept of chance when he moves from biology to history, to the noosphere. Practically, then, the emergence-chance couple permits Monod to think as emergences based on chance phenomena that are perfectly explicable on the basis of a science of history, whose existence he neither mentions nor even suspects. In most of Monod's historical examples, Shakespeare, communism, Stalin, etc., chance functions in a sense that is the opposite of the way it functions in biology, not as an index of the conditions of the existence of emergence, but as a biologistic theory of history itself. A striking symptom of this inversion is provided by Monod's historical Darwinism. While he does not cause the theory of natural selection to intervene in biology, he resorts to it suddenly and on a grand scale in history, speaking of the great mind who will write a history of the selection of ideas. It is unusual to see a notion like natural selection, a notion which biology has strictly delimited or even profoundly transformed, suddenly being put to full use in history. It is clear that for Monod the underdevelopment of history justifies an uncontrolled and excessive use of the concept, in a way which has nothing in common with the use biology itself makes of it. In any event, the result that interests us is this: through its uncontrolled use, chance changes its meaning and tendency. It has passed from a materialist to an idealist functioning. And as chance is bound up with emergence, emergence too is transformed. I will therefore summarize in a word, or in little more than a word, what we have said in the course of analyzing the content of elements 1 and 2 of Monod's SPS. Monod's SPS is a borderline SPS, and it is exemplary in its simplicity and clarity. It is remarkable in that it reveals that the distinction introduced in our previous lectures between element 1 and element 2 affects not only the conceptual content of the two elements, but also the different tendencies with which a single content may be invested. The content of the two elements of monads SPS is essentially the same. It is constituted by a certain number of key concepts. In monads' case, the concepts of matter, physical support, living system, chance, and emergence. These are the concepts common to the two elements. The concept of the noosphere is then added to element 2, but because the concept of biosphere figures in element 1, it might be thought that we are dealing with the complement that the concept of biosphere carries within it. The content of elements 1 and 2 is therefore essentially the same content. However, there is, as we have said, a contradiction between the two elements. Element 1 is materialist and element 2 is idealist. This contradiction cannot affect the content of the two elements because the content is common to them, it therefore affects their meaning, the significance of the use made of them, that is, the tendency with which explicit or implicit use invests them. From this we may conclude that the contradiction between element 1 and element 2 of monads SPS is a contradiction between the materialist and idealist tendencies in relation to his representation of the content of his scientific knowledges, the current state of biology, of the validity of the use and extension of his key concepts, and of the nature of scientific knowledge in general. We may also note that the materialist tendency can be positively asserted only in the struggle against idealist, spiritualist and religious philosophical exploitations of the problems of biology, the struggle against tailored, and therefore that element 1 is not a pure statement of the reality of scientific practice, but a result that must be won in a polemical struggle. But we may note at the same time that the idealist tendency which, in the form of its representatives, tailored, was expelled from element 1, in fact reappears in the idealist element 2. The proof, we find that in element 2 one of Tailored's key concepts has re-entered through the window, the concept of the noosphere. The idealist tendency against which monad struggles, with all his strength, in order to make the materialist tendency in element 1 triumph, secretly re-enters through the window to triumph in element 2. What is tragic is that it is monad himself who opens the window. And because we cannot theoretically compare a scientist to a man who willingly opens a window to let the wind of idealism rush in, we say that it is the wind of idealism itself that opens the window. It has all the power necessary. All that may be said of monad is that he does not prevent the window from being opened, he does not resist the idealist tendency. Indeed, he gives in to it, thinking that he resists it. Which proves that element 2 is always stronger than element 1. Which proves that the SPS cannot with its forces alone prevent the window from being opened. And which proves that the SPS needs the support of an external force, allied with element 1, if it is to triumph over element 2, the support of an external tendency that reinforces the materialist tendency of element 1 to reverse the meaning of the idealist tendency of element 2. We may finally take note of something important that recapitulates what I have said concerning the differential receptivity of scientists to certain terms, such as materialism, according to their discipline. In monad's case, modern biology, the notions of materialism and of the dialectic not only pose no problems, at least in the branch in which monad works, but they work quite well with the content of element 1. In the case of modern biology, or at least the branch to which Monod has devoted his work, the expression dialectical materialism may be admissible, at least provisionally and pending further information. But as I am speaking not only to an audience of biologists, but also to many other scientists and literary specialists, I can imagine what they are thinking. To address only those who are really and truly in a different world from Monod, I can guess what the mathematicians are thinking. What I have just said of a biologist may perhaps apply to biology. But mathematics? You know the famous passage from Sartre's words, in which he explains that he has no superego. The superego, when it exists, is that of others. The SPS, when it exists, is that of others. I would simply point out to the mathematicians present that, should they ever think in petto that they are saved by the grace of mathematics, its grace, that is, not only its beauty but also its purity and its rigor, from any SPS, there are a considerable number of texts by great mathematicians which might be analyzed as I have just analyzed Monod's text, and it is highly probable that such an analysis would produce similar results. And to give a precise example, I call their attention to the existence of a short text by Lichtnerowitz, delivered to the Société Française de Philosophie on February 27, 1965. This text bears a title that I would never have dared to invent: Mathematical Activity and Its Role in Our Conception of the World. I want to point out that in the subsequent debate Cartan made some very interesting comments. In this discussion, the roles were clearly demarcated. Lichtnerowitz's arguments were openly idealist, those of Cartan were rather materialist. They may rest assured, mathematicians too have an SPS. They too, in their SPS, are contradictory representatives of tendencies that transcend them and confront each other, the materialist and the idealist. And to ensure that no one feels left out, I will say, philosophers too, but in the case of philosophers, their SPP is not a philosophy but their worldview. 3. Philosophy. After all I have just said, I will speak only briefly of the two last characters in our little theater, philosophy and worldview. Philosophy is present in Monod's lecture in two forms, first in the form of philosophical terms borrowed from existing philosophies, which function in the interior of his spontaneous philosophy. Insofar as these terms are borrowed from existing philosophies, they refer back to those philosophies. Philosophy is also present in the form of explicit philosophical arguments. Monod knows what philosophies are, or at least knows that they exist and are particularly concerned with what happens in the sciences. In this connection he cites Aristotle, the philosophies of Kant and Hegel, dialectical materialism, Engels, whom he attacks with particular violence, Nietzsche and Taylor de Chardin. Monod is particularly perspicacious in his materialist moment, that is, in his attack on Taylor. He says that this philosophy is not new, an insight which pleases us but will by no means please everyone. Monod is not content simply to cite philosophers. He does philosophy. He even proposes a definition of philosophy, by saying that its function is above all to establish a system of values and contrasting it with the sciences, which have nothing to do with values. On this theme, he develops a whole philosophical argument. The most remarkable philosophical terms present in Monad's course are the following: noosphere, biosphere, tailored, condemned as a philosophical exploiter of biology, resurfaces as the positive philosopher of the noosphere, that is, of human history. Alienation, praxis, nothingness, in Nietzsche's sense, etc. Further, an entire series of apparently innocent notions are employed and function philosophically in Monad. For example, the notion of man, in the phrase, "It is language that seems to have created man rather than man language." There is no need to go further. We are in a philosophical atmosphere with an idealist allure. Certain words are never pronounced: materialism, dialectical, etc., or, more precisely, with an existentialist spiritualist Nietzschean atheist allure. A self-declared atheism emerges in the final words, in which Sartre, like Nietzsche, would find it as difficult to disown their child as to recognize him. What ideal may we propose to men today, an ideal which is both above them and beyond them, if not the conquest through knowledge of the nothingness they themselves have discovered? More interesting is the fact that Monad has given us a genuine chapter of philosophy in the strong sense, that is, a chapter of philosophy that bears directly on the relation between philosophy and the sciences. A distinction between philosophy and the sciences. Knowledge, not values, belongs to the sciences. Values belong to philosophy. A distinction between scientific method and scientific ethics. Even today, the ethics of knowledge is often confused with scientific method itself. But method is a normative epistemology, not an ethics. Method tells us to seek. But what commands us to seek and to adopt a method, and the asceticism it implies, in order to seek? Sciences, scientific method, normative epistemology, ethics of knowledge, values, philosophy. Monad has done his philosophical work very well. He draws lines of demarcation and proposes a line that is for him, and for any philosopher, a correct line. There is no point in quibbling over certain of Monad's philosophical expressions, for he is not a professional philosopher and that would be unfair. On the contrary, we should be very grateful to him for having expounded his philosophy and, through it, his relation to the existing philosophical tendencies. Monad's philosophical tendency, resulting from the comparison between the kind of terms he borrows and the philosophical argument he puts forward, an idealist spiritualist tendency accompanied by a categorical declaration of atheism. The result, the primacy of an atheist ethics. Spiritualism is severed from its religious moorings by the declaration of atheism, leaving, in the final analysis, an atheist ethics, a morality of science or, more precisely, an ethics of scientific practice. An ascetic morality, austere, aristocratic in its austerity, without any other object of reference than the practice of knowledge, a refusal to give this morality the foundation of human happiness, its material power, or a know thyself. What interests us in a very precise sense is the organic relation that exists between Monad's philosophy and his SPS. The same atheist idealist tendency. The same accent on scientific practice. In philosophy as in the SPS, the presence of an objectivist materialist reference, the ultimate core of which is scientific knowledge and its practice. While at the same time, in philosophy as in the SPS, the materialist tendency is surrounded by the idealist tendency that dominates it, We have seen how this investment is carried out in Monad's SPS. We have established the existence of the same idealist investment in Monad's philosophy. But what is extremely remarkable, and I ask you to note this point because it is of the greatest importance, this siege does not take the form of an inversion of meaning whose moments and terms we might observe and describe in detail, empirically. There is a certain tension, and therefore a certain presence of the tendential struggle between idealism and materialism, in Monad's philosophy. The fact that he speaks of science might be considered an echo of the materialist tendency, especially in that he rejects religion. His morality might be considered an overt and dominant representation of the idealist tendency. But it is clear that this tension, and the outcome of this conflict, have been decided in advance in favor of the idealist tendency, which triumphs without a struggle in the exaltation of the ethics of knowledge. What is the underlying element in these links, which are merely statements of objective relations, that binds Monad's philosophy to his SPS? Essentially, what they have in common, or, to be more specific, what his philosophy has in common with element 2 of the SPS, an idealist philosophy of science that allows the extension of biological categories to the noosphere, authorizing a conception of the noosphere based on an idealist theory of history, which permits the exaltation of the ethics of knowledge to a place in the philosophy of science. Their common content can be written in the form of a sequence of transformed identities: emergence of the noosphere, history equals noosphere equals realm of scientific knowledge equals scientific activity equals ethics of scientific knowledge. This sequence, which we could examine in detail, rests in the last resort on the two following identities: history equals noosphere equals the science S. What therefore permits Monad's philosophy in the last resort to communicate with his SPS is the philosophical operator noosphere, whose meaning, the effect of its intervention, may be simply understood by saying that it represents a conception of history classic since the 18th century, since the Aufklärung, wherein it is the sciences that are the motor of history, and history is ultimately reducible to the history of knowledges, of the sciences and scientific ideas. But Monad's philosophy of science is not merely a philosophy of science. Like every philosophy of science, it is a more or less openly avowed philosophy of history. If Monad is exemplary here, it is because he openly avows his philosophy of history. It is through it that we shall enter into the last object of our analysis, his worldview. 4. Monad's worldview, WV. Remember what we have said about the difference that distinguishes a philosophy from a worldview. A worldview may well deal with science, but a worldview is never centered on science as philosophy is. It does not maintain the same relations with the sciences as philosophy does. A worldview is centered on something other than the sciences, on what we have called the values of practical ideologies. A worldview expresses tendencies that traverse practical ideologies, religious, juridical, political, etc. A WV is always directly or indirectly concerned with the questions that pertain to these domains, problems of religion, morality, politics, and ultimately with the problem of the meaning of history, of the salvation of human history. Every WV finally expresses a certain tendency of a political character or appearance. What is remarkable about Monad is that this is all in the open. At the center of his WV, the problem of the alienation of the modern world, and of the salvation of the modern world. The alienation of the modern world, created, woven by science, it is a stranger in its own land. Why? The alienation of modern man from the scientific culture that has nonetheless woven his universe is revealed in forms other than that of the naive horror expressed by Verlaine. I see in this dualism one of the most profound evils afflicting modern societies, an evil that is bringing about a disequilibrium so serious that it threatens the future realization of the great dream of the 19th century, the future emergence of a society no longer constructed against man but for him. The alienation of the modern world therefore threatens the great socialist dream itself. Monad is for socialism, but concern for its future. Alienation, dualism. Between the science and scientific culture that have woven the modern world, on the one hand, and traditional values, ideas rich in ethical content, on the other. We are therefore faced with the following contradiction: modern societies still live, assert and teach, without believing in them, value systems whose base has been destroyed, but, having been woven by science, those same societies owe their emergence to the adoption, usually implicitly and by a very small number of men, of an ethics of knowledge of which they know nothing. That is the very root of modern alienation. Double contradiction: modern science and outdated religious moral values whose base has been destroyed. Modern science and the failure of men, and even scientists themselves, to recognize that these sciences and their practice imply a moral discipline, a veritable ethics of knowledge. Now, in the contradiction of the modern world between contemporary science and earlier anachronistic values, there is both extreme alienation and the means of salvation, which are contained in an ethics of scientific knowledge. What is this theory of the alienation of the modern world? Apparently a description of a certain number of empirical facts. In reality, two things: 1. A theory of history. 2. A politics. The theory of history may be summarized thus. Monad knows that human history is not exclusively constituted by what happens in the order of scientific knowledge. There also exists an order of praxis, of material power, of religious, moral and political passions. But Monad thinks that what is specific to man, what makes him a social and historical being, what constitutes the noosphere, is language and the scientific knowledge which emerges from it at a certain moment. In any event, it is clear to Monad that in the modern world science is the basis of history, that the activity of the scientist weaves the modern world, and that its salvation lies in a scientific ethics. This theory of history opens unto a politics of the elaboration and diffusion of the ethics of knowledge. The basis of the modern world is scientific knowledge. The motor of the salvation of modern history may be the ethics of knowledge. Monad therefore advances a WV that proposes a politics of education, communication and moral propaganda. A specific moral doctrine, but a moral doctrine just the same, from which he expects political effects, including, if I understand him correctly, the hope of the advent of socialism. There are 2 points to be noted. 1. In Monad's WV there exists an internally consistent unity between a philosophy of history, an idealist philosophy which makes knowledge the essence and lever of history, and a politics, an ethical politics. Every WV is directly or indirectly related to a certain politics. Every WV advances, directly or indirectly, explicitly or implicitly, a certain politics. This is true of all worldviews. A religious WV emphasizes religion, religious values. It proposes a choice between different values. It proposes a politics that can be translated into deeds. Item: a moral WV. The same is true of a juridical WV. To emphasize law, seen as the essential factor in the dialectic of history, is to seek to produce certain historical effects. This kind of WV is common amongst jurists, but it is not unique to them. A political WV emphasizes political values. It assumes that politics constitutes the essential factor in history, that politics is the motor of history, etc., and from this it expects certain effects. 2. A WV does not exist in isolation. It exists only in a defined field in which it seeks to situate itself vis-à-vis existing worldviews, and therefore to distinguish itself from existing WVs, to define itself as different in relation to them, including by opposition to certain of them. A WV is posited only by opposing and, ultimately, by struggling against the WVs different from it. In his WV, Monod manifestly attempts to distinguish himself from two worldviews, from the religious WV, of the tailored variety, and the Marxist WV. Against the religious WV he asserts that neither religious values, nor traditional moral values based on religion, can save the modern world, hence a struggle against religious WVs, but only a new morality, a non-religious, atheistic, ascetic morality based on scientific practice, the morality of scientists. Against the Marxist WV he asserts that it is the development of knowledge and the values proper to it which are the motor of modern history, and therefore that what will put an end to the alienation of the modern world is a certain subjective aristocratic intellectual morality, and not the Marxist morality based on the proletarian class struggle. Note this very important point. Monod does not differentiate himself in the same way from the two worldviews. He differentiates himself from the religious WV by struggling against it overtly, to suppress it, for he sees it as harmful and outdated. He also differentiates himself from the Marxist WV, but without seeking to suppress it. He declares war on the first but not on the second. He has not renounced the dream it still embodies for him, the dream of socialism. Monod's worldview is thus very specific. It is a WV which proposes a theory or a philosophy of history capable of furnishing an interpretation of the present historical conjuncture and the means of exiting from it. This naturally results in a politics. As a WV this conception takes sides, and is necessarily situated among the existing WVs. It takes a position between a traditionalist WV, dominated by a religious moral politics, and a Marxist WV, dominated by what we might call a political morality. But here we find that everything changes, not from the point of view of Monod's declarations but from the point of view of the real content of his theoretical theses. For this intermediate position is not equal. Monod's position is not equidistant from the two WVs. What separates Monod from the religious WV, which he combats so resolutely, does not call into question the validity of morality as the motor of history. It is simply that the morality he proposes is not a religious morality but an atheist morality centered on the spontaneous ethics of scientific knowledge. This morality, however, remains a morality. What separates monad from the Marxist WV, on the other hand, is much more important. It is a serious difference over the question of the role of morality in history. For monad, morality is considered to be, and is then proposed as, the means of salvation for modern history and therefore as the motor, if not of history, at least of modern history. For Marxism, morality, even a political morality, is not the motor of history, past or modern. In the expression I have just used, political morality, it is the word political that counts for Marxists. And politics means class struggle of the masses, as defined by the two great principles of Marxism. 1. It is the masses that make history, not individuals, intellectuals or even scientists. 2. It is the class struggle that is the motor of history, not morality, not even an atheist, ascetic morality, a pure and disinterested morality of the most disinterested of intellectuals, scientists. What divides the WVs is definitely something that goes beyond their ideological content and touches upon their political tendency. Idealism equals the belief that ideas rule the world. Materialism equals the belief that the class struggle of the masses is the motor of history. On this fundamental point, Monad's theoretical theses enter into contradiction with the way he has situated his WV vis-a-vis the religious and Marxist WVs. The contradiction, the essential opposition, concerns not the religious WV but the Marxist WV. Not idealism but materialism. One last word, how is the relationship between Monad's WV and his philosophy established? Through the intermediary of the ethics of scientific knowledge. Monad's philosophy is a philosophy of science. His WV is a WV of scientific ethics. Monad's philosophy and his WV have science in common. Science lies at the heart of Monad's SPS. And finally, science is Monad's activity. And one last conclusion, if these four characters or elements that we have identified in Monad's text, science, SPS, philosophy, WV, are plotted on a graph, a very particular overlapping may be seen to occur. 1. Nucleus 1 equals the reality of science that exists in the reality of the scientific findings Monad describes, which allude to the reality of scientific practice, and to the reality of the history of the production of biological knowledges. The materialist tendency. This nucleus 1 irradiates the set with its materialist dialectical tendency. It is present in the tendency of element 1 of Monad's SPS. It is present, in a very modified and extremely attenuated fashion, in Monad's philosophy. There are some negative traces, atheistic morality, in Monad's WV. 2. Nucleus 2 equals reality, what is at the heart of Monad's WV, a political prize position against other political positions. An idealist tendency that asserts itself in a subordinate fashion against the religious spiritualist tendency, but asserts itself in a dominant fashion against the materialist tendency of the class struggle. Representing the existence of two irradiating nuclei. This nucleus too irradiates the entire set of elements present in Monad's text. Its irradiating tendency is idealist. It is idealist in an inverse way, in an increasingly attenuated fashion, but the filiation and the dependence are clearly recognizable. It is dependent on philosophy, the idealist philosophy of science. On element 2 of the SPS, an idealist interpretation of the materialist content of element 1. This result is simple but very important. Two irradiating nuclei, centers of opposed tendencies, a materialist tendency radiating from the material objective nucleus of scientific practice and science itself, and an idealist tendency radiating from Monad's ideological position in the face of values implied by the social-political ideological problems that divide the modern world. Monad's SPS, philosophy and WVR, in their various ways and depending upon their proximity to these two nuclei, compromises between these two tendencies. The point at which the two tendencies clash most openly is the SPS. In the contradiction between element 1 and element 2. In this contradiction, the dominant element is element 2. Here too, when we closely examine the confrontation of the two tendencies and the realist-materialist nucleus, that is, scientific practice, we find the law which I stated earlier, the domination of element 1 by element 2. The exploitation of element 1 by element 2. Philosophie et philosophie spontanée des savants, François Maspero, Paris 1974. Translated by Warren Montag. For Lenin and philosophy, may I thank your society for the honor it has done me in inviting me to present to it what it has called since it came into existence, and will doubtless long continue to call, by a disarmingly nostalgic name, a communication. To the first eye, a scientist is justified in presenting a communication before a scientific society. A communication and a discussion are possible only if they are scientific. But a philosophical communication and a philosophical discussion? Philosophical communication. This term would certainly have made Lenin laugh, with that wholehearted, open laugh by which the fishermen of Capri recognized him as one of their kind and on their side. This was exactly 60 years ago, in 1908. Lenin was then at Capri, as a guest of Gorky, whose generosity he liked and whose talent he admired, but whom he treated nevertheless as a petty bourgeois revolutionary. Gorky had invited him to Capri to take part in philosophical discussions with a small group of Bolshevik intellectuals whose positions Gorky shared, the Otzovists. 1908, the aftermath of the First October Revolution, that of 1905, the ebb tide and repression of the workers' movement. And also disarray among the intellectuals, including the Bolshevik intellectuals. Several of them had formed a group known to history by the name Otzovists. Politically, the Otzovists were leftists, in favor of radical measures, recall, Utzovit of the party's Duma representatives, rejection of every form of legal action and immediate recourse to violent action. But these leftist proclamations concealed rightist theoretical positions. The Otzovists were infatuated with a fashionable philosophy or philosophical fashion, empirio-criticism, which had been updated in form by the famous Austrian physicist Ernst Mach. This physicist's and physiologist's philosophy, Mach was not just anybody, he has left his name in the history of the sciences, was not without affinity with other philosophies manufactured by scientists like Henri Poincaré, and by historians of science like Pierre Duhem and Abel Ray. These are phenomena which we are beginning to understand. When certain sciences undergo important revolutions, at that time mathematics and physics, there will always be professional philosophers to proclaim